Welcome, everyone, to yet another edition of Untimely Reflections, Conversations on the Nietzsche podcast. And today I am here with Jimmy Burke. He is the host of Will to Joy. Nietzsche for Life is the subtitle. It is a podcast also on the work of Friedrich Nietzsche that I would highly recommend. We're going to talk about a recent episode of the show, and that was a rather special episode of the show. But before we get into that, Jimmy, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience? Let everyone know what it is that you do, what your project is, what your mission statement is. I guess a little bit of background about yourself as well.
Thanks for having me on, Keegan. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been listening to your show since episode 4, and I took a look at Apple Podcasts, and that's 2021. So I've been listening to your show for 4 years, and during my own Nietzsche researches, yours has been the only show that I've listened to consistently. So it's quite surreal for me to be talking to you now, and a
Thank
real
you.
pleasure to be here.
That's a real honor. Thank you.
So, yeah, I've been working on Nietzschean philosophy myself, specifically on the project of making it practical and actionable for the past 8 years. And I started the Will to Joy podcast earlier this year. And as you rightly point out, the strapline is Nietzsche for life. And the podcast is really, I guess I've been writing for such a long time that I really felt the need to get something out there, share some ideas, perhaps start a conversation. And the podcast for me is really a stretching of the limbs. I'm trying things out. There's little dramatic vignettes in there, which you may have come across. And also, I changed the title halfway through as well. So that's how much of a work in progress it is. But my interest in Nietzsche, or my particular approach around making it practical, stems from the fact that I've worked in the field of evidence-based behavior change, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing for almost 25 years. So behavior change has been front and center in my life. And I've been writing the book since 2017. And currently it's absolutely enormous. I mean, it's not a book, it's a huge, sprawling tract of about 500,000 words, which is somewhat approaching War and Peace by Tolstoy.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so you have to write something out and then you have to distill and crystallize what it is you're actually trying to say. And I'm at that point now, and I expect to be putting something out there finally, hopefully early in 2026, and particularly around the theme that I explored in the episode you mentioned, which is around sex and the aesthetic impulse and culture, actually, which as an artist, obviously, that's going to be of particular interest to you. So the point of Nietzschean philosophy is not just to understand it, of course, it's to be changed by it. And I'm pretty sure that everyone who's read Nietzsche in earnest feels that they've had their worldview changed to some extent. But I wanted to run with its practical implications just to see how far it could go. So yeah, my first exposure, like a lot of people, to Nietzsche was at university when I was in my 20s. And although I found his writing alluring and enigmatic and seductive, I really didn't grasp it theoretically. So I had an issue with comprehension, but also I wanted to know how it would be practically implemented and what its value could be for life. It makes me think of the Nietzsche quote regarding Goethe, where he says, "I hate everything that merely instructs me without augmenting or directly invigorating my activity," which I think is in Untimely Meditations. So the question for me has been, how does one action his strange anti-philosophy? And to be honest, I waited for years for somebody else to write the book that I'm now writing. And every few years I would browse over the internet. Oh, has anybody written that book yet? And nobody had. In 2007, an academic philosopher called Robert Solomon wrote a book called Nietzsche, Living with Nietzsche, which is an excellent book, and I recommend it to you and your listeners. But
Yeah,
again,
I've
it
read
was
it.
more kind of advice and guidance. Oh, yeah,
Yeah, I very much like Robert Solomon's work.
yeah, rest in peace.
Yes, yeah.
And in the meantime, I'd stumbled into evidence-based behavior change services. I did my master's in public health, and my dissertation was on behavior change methodologies. So I gradually became kind of somewhat equipped to tackle this practical exposition. The real gap was in my understanding of Nietzsche, and so I've been spending the last 8 years really immersing myself in Nietzsche's corpus. There was an inciting incident for me in 2017 because my younger brother died that year. And I guess contemplating my own mortality, I decided that if this book wasn't going to appear from another author, I should have a crack at writing it myself. And little did I know what an enormous undertaking it would be. I thought it'd be done in 6 months. I've got a tendency to be a bit overambitious and to underestimate how long things take. And if people listen to my podcast, they'll encounter that particular trait because I promise things and then I realize that they're going to take a little bit longer. And that's currently the case with my season finale episode. But not to digress, in 2017, I did some hiking on the island of Corsica in the Mediterranean, doing a trail called the GR20, which is supposed to be the toughest mountain trail in Europe. And appropriately, it's on that trail on my own that I started sketching out the idea for my book about Nietzsche. And I took along Hollingdale's Nietzsche reader, with which I'm sure you're familiar. But I still found his philosophy quite opaque, and it's taken me a few years and a systematic study of his entire output to really get to a position where I feel I have some understanding of his philosophy, sufficient to be able to talk to other people about it. And then 2 years ago, another inciting incident is I lost another friend who fell in a river drunk and died of hypothermia. And at that point, I was leading a team of 40 advisors and up to 100 community advisors, coaches, and volunteers, supporting people to provide weight management support, support around physical activity, stop smoking services, drug and alcohol addiction. And I decided that I was going to quit that job and focus full time on bringing this project to realization. So that's what I've been doing the last 2 years. And yeah, it's been an adventure. I guess appropriately, it's had its abysses of despair and its summits of exhilaration. But I never anticipated it would be such a comprehensive challenge. But it's been really worthwhile, actually. Yeah, the essential question that I'm trying to draw out is using Nietzsche's philosophy, what is the good life and how does one live it? And to do that, I've been marrying his philosophy with evolutionary psychology and behavioral science. And yeah, hopefully something early next year. Yeah, and then as you mentioned, I submitted an abstract for the Friedrich Nietzsche Society conference in Belfast earlier this year in the summer. And I wasn't holding my breath on that one because that's an academic body and I am not an academic. But to my surprise, I was invited to speak last month to about 70 delegates. Only two or three of us were not academics, so that was quite nerve-wracking. And it was kind of ironic because Nietzsche, well, you know the kind of his misgivings about academia, and he would have kind of loved that conference and hated it at the same time, I suspect. But that was, yeah, a real eye opener and an opportunity to get in a room with a lot of experts and fly some of my ideas by them. So yeah, I guess that's a bit of background on me.
Yeah, there's a lot that's very interesting there, and so many things I want to talk about. I couldn't help but think of the quote from Pascal when you were talking about your book, where he says, I've written you something that is very long only because I have not had the time to make it shorter, which
Ah,
is a real truth. I think it's the editing, it's the revising, it's killing your
mm,
darlings. That's always the most difficult thing.
yeah.
And yeah, honing everything. So I definitely want to talk about the Nietzschean Society. But first, some of the things you mentioned with your book. For the audience members who are not as familiar with, say, cognitive behavioral therapy, or
Mm,
these sorts of, as you put it, evidence-based, applied psychology, right?
yeah.
What is the way in which introducing Nietzsche's philosophy into cognitive behavioral therapy, or this entire sort of,
Yeah. I,
practical application of psychology? Maybe could you go over what the basics are without Nietzsche, or where you were
yeah.
before you read Nietzsche, and then in what way Nietzsche changes that for you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, cognitive behavioral therapy quite simply means relating your thinking to your actions. So there's often a bit of a gap between the thoughts and your intentions and what you actually end up doing. So I think we can all see how that's like a problem for human beings. I'm sure we've all encountered that particular tension at times. But what really became apparent to me when I was working in contemporary evidence-based behavior change is that there was this sort of drift towards some of the suppositions in Nietzsche that wasn't explicit, but that was implicit. For instance, I guess there was a time when people thought, like, say if you want to quit smoking, what you have to do is apply yourself. You have to harness your own willpower to make that change. Well, in contemporary behavior change, the idea that you can just like muster the willpower to be able to change your behavior is kind of dismissed because what it suggests, well, first of all, is kind of a moral framing of a problem. It's like, have you got the character to change your behavior? But what we do in contemporary behavior change, instead of just advising people to try and try harder, we advise them to change the environment such that they make the right choices automatically. So in the case of a smoker, it might be getting rid of ashtrays, it might be finding a replacement behavior using an e-cigarette, eating carrot sticks, avoiding routines, like even simple things like have tea instead of coffee in the morning, change what time you get up. Because what that recognizes is that behaviors are environmentally situated and environmentally stimulated. And so you need to move away from the triggers that create the habit. And so what's implicit in that for me is a skepticism towards the idea of free will. It's not the case that we just choose our behaviors. We don't choose when we want to take a drug or not, or choose to have a cigarette, or choose to, eat cream cakes instead of going to the gym. It feels like we do. That's the phenomenology of it. But in actual fact, there's something more complicated going on. And you can already recognize probably that I'm talking about Nietzsche's drive psychology. There's a multitude of different drives all competing for expression in everybody's psyche. And that's why it seems so impossibly difficult to be able to make the right choices all the time. Because the drive that prevails at any particular moment might not be the one that's got your long-term best interests at heart, your quote unquote higher self. It'll be an appetite or an ingrained response to a particular stimulus. And so that to me, I thought Nietzsche was in so many ways Nietzsche was ahead of his time, but he really intuited that early on, that it's not the case that there's just some autonomous agent making choices. And if they make the wrong choice, well, that's a moral failing. There's something much more interesting going on.
Can I cut
So
in for a
carry on.
second?
Yes,
Yeah,
sure.
because that's incredibly fascinating. It reminded me of, I believe it was in a psychology class. I don't remember where I heard this exactly, but it was a lady who was a smoker who was talking about the experience she had of promising a friend that she would never smoke again, but then having the thought that, well, it's not really my responsibility if she smokes again. And the she was
Mm,
thinking of is herself. It was almost like a
yeah,
sub personality that was craving the cigarettes. And
yeah,
it's interesting that the way you put it, that so much of what Nietzsche prefigured in his work is now coming to be seen as somewhat almost obvious among a
mm,
lot of the psychological research, but I think even in people's personal experience that many of us have, that they experience these things as competing drives or forces within themselves that
yeah,
don't seem as though they're constituent parts of an autonomous self, but that they have
yeah,
their own agendas.
yeah.
And so you would say the field has already started to onboard some of what Nietzsche wrote about and perhaps hasn't maybe incorporated his philosophy with the understanding that he made a lot of these prefigurations. Is that maybe what you're getting at, is maybe making that more explicit, the Nietzschean, I don't want to say influence, but Nietzsche's wisdom or insights in
Yeah.
applying them to CBT?
Yeah, and not just CBT, but motivation, just behavior change generally. Why do there was a whole thing a few years ago, and I'm sure you kind of heard about it, like nudge theory, about how you design an environment to encourage a population to make the right choices. So, classic example would be if you give a person a small plate when they go up to a buffet, they will eat less. They will eat less, even though they know that, hang on a minute, this plate's a bit small, I'm going to go back multiple times. People can even know that they're being manipulated and they will still like behave in the way that the environment determines. So it's the idea that we're all freely willing agents has been significantly undermined by that research. You don't hear quite so much of it anymore, but it was informing government policy in the UK and the US just a few years ago.
Well, I think some people find it a bit disturbing because it's like
Yeah,
there's a technocratic element to that,
yeah,
right? That if
sure.
the world can become a Skinner box or
Yeah,
something like that.
yeah.
And I think even if they know that and acknowledge that you can nudge people in their environment, they may not be
Mm,
as willing to speak about that openly because that
mm,
it's not a very good message for voters, for example. Like
yeah,
we're going to nudge you in the right direction,
yeah,
something like that. Even though it may be absolutely the case that that's what's necessary,
yeah.
to have a productive environment or something like that.
Sure. I mean, of course, the thing is, speaking ethically, the thing is to be honest about it. So another really good example from the canteen is that if you put the salad bar first instead of last, people will eat more salad. So it's healthier eating. As long as you're honest and open about that, it still works. This is the crazy thing about it. And another real textbook example of this nudge theory was with organ donor cards in some European countries. I think Germany was one. It used to be the case that when you got the driving license in Germany, there was a box that you could tick that said that you consented to donate your organs in the event of your death in a traffic accident. So if you tick the box, they've got permission to use your organs. Okay, so about 5% of people tick that box. Then they change the question. Tick the box if you don't want us to use your organs in the event of your death. And what do you know? It completely flipped around, and 95% of people didn't tick the box and became organ donors. Now, that was completely apparent and transparent. It was written there. People could read the statement. It's just a case that humans tend to follow the path of least resistance. So if you make the path of least resistance, if you make the easy thing to do, the right thing to do, that's generally what will happen across a population. People will follow that trend. But, it is a form of manipulation. And so there is that ethical tension within it, certainly.
This raises a question that just kind of spontaneously came to me, though, because I know more than one alcoholic in the music scene who has successfully kicked alcohol, but they managed to remain in the environment of being in bars every night
Wow.
around people
Yeah.
drinking. And one of
Mm,
them is he does Alcoholics Anonymous, which I noticed I never really knew anyone who was involved in AA, and I realized how religious it is. It's
mm,
definitely almost a religion for him, which
mm.
that makes sense to me, or it made more sense to me understanding that. I don't know. I wonder, is there anything in this evidence-based behavior change that has to do with explaining that? What about when you can't change the environment? Is that something that
Yeah.
you've looked into as well?
Sure. Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be the physical environment. It really helps for it to be the physical environment, but significant life change constitutes, quote unquote, environmental alteration that creates an opportunity to change behavior. So, sometimes when people have a baby, they quit smoking and they find it much easier to do that than they would do otherwise. They've got a significant motivation to do that. But also, you have a baby, your routines all change, everything changes. So you're not adhering to the same patterns of behavior that you were previously simply because you can. Actually, many years ago, I acquired a new girlfriend who I went out with for a number of years, and she was a smoker. And we went to Thailand, like traveling, backpacking around for 3 months. And as soon as we got on the plane, she quit smoking and never smoked again. And it was that radical change of the environment that provided the opportunity to abandon these habits that are triggered by our routines, our everyday routines.
You have like the radical change for a few months of the backpacking trip, but then you're able to take that with you afterwards of the
Yeah,
behavioral change.
yeah, yeah.
Interesting.
Your friend who quit alcohol, I wonder, did they have a replacement behavior? What often happens with situations like that when somebody manages to kick drugs or alcohol, they become like gin fanatics. That's a classic replacement. behavior. It's a new bunch of routines, a new compulsion that replaces the old one. Um,
Yeah, I think for him, it actually AA was part of that.
right.
Going to the
Yeah.
meetings and having this adopting other thing. I think AA has become a bit more new age now,
Right.
so they're
Yeah.
teaching people how to meditate and things like that. So he was doing some of that. He still had some the replacement behaviors. I don't know if they're all positive because I see that with people where everyone wants a treat now and then,
Yeah.
even if it's
Sure.
not the really bad one that you've tried to get rid of, right? And
Yeah.
so it might just be a classic like I'm gonna have a piece of candy rather than go take a shot,
Yeah. Yeah.
something like that. And
Hmm.
you can sort of tell yourself a story about how I'm no longer taking in the calories I was taking from drinking,
Mm.
those liquid calories. I've earned, I can have like a bit more indulgence in
Yeah.
my sweet tooth or something like that. And,
Yeah.
the issue is I do remember speaking to a friend of mine who was trying to, I don't even remember which habit he was trying to kick, but he said something like, it feels like no matter what I get rid of, there's always some new vice that creeps in.
Yeah.
And so that does seem kind of interesting that you always have to replace it with something.
Yeah, they should try gym. That's the classic one, and it
Sure.
does tend to work because everyone knows about the endorphins, and there's a new community, and you get invested. Once you start making some gains, you get really invested because that's quite motivating in itself to see weight drop off, things like that. But it's interesting because, like Nietzsche, he doesn't talk about behavior change techniques that except in that one aphorism with the sort of six ways of changing behavior. Is
Sure.
it in that's in
And
Dawn, isn't it?
yeah, the dawn.
Daybreak. Yeah,
Although
yeah,
he does conclude that by saying, by the way, whichever one of these you manage to adopt
yeah.
is actually the weapon or the tool of an individual drive. It's not your
That's
reason
right.
coming in and autonomously choosing. But he does
Yeah.
say these are six ways that I guess you could say drives overcome one another or check one
Mm,
another. So it
yeah.
is, which is a technique. I mean, that's the thing is a lot of people do get sort of, I think, caught in the free will thing in terms
Yeah.
of you deny free will. Okay, how am I supposed to make the decision? And I
Mm,
think many of the things that you've brought up point in the direction of how you would go about doing that. That yes, you
yeah.
can be consciously aware that you are attempting to trick yourself
Mm,
at the behest of a drive that's trying to overcome another one. And
yeah.
yet, people make decisions every day and make life changes every day all over the world. It's not impossible.
Mm,
And so I think, yeah, he does. I'm sorry for that digression, but yeah, that's really the one where I think he gives real technical advice, and even then, it's with the caveat that it's not an act of your autonomous reason.
well, exactly. But interestingly, those six techniques. The first five, at least, are very well evidence-based. Yeah, so it's amazing that he kind of intuited those. He did describe himself as a psychologist first and foremost, and he does a really good job. The first one is avoidance, then there's rationing, overindulgence, which is making yourself like so sick with your habit that you become disgusted, and that creates an aversion, and then the negative association and diversion, such as replacing drinking with gym, as we've been discussing. And then the last one, which is the one that doesn't have an evidence base because there could be no possible ethical experiments for this one, which is the exhaustion, the most dangerous method and not really recommended, where, the example would be the mystic who tries to extirpate his sexual lust by self-flagellation and depreciating the entire organism to the point that it simply can't pursue that habit anymore.
Where we see it most today, I think, are in the really ascetic Buddhist sects, like the Thai forest
Mm.
monks. They're a normal set of vows of poverty and self-abnegation and these things that are taken by normal Buddhist monks. And then they take even more. They have to pick, I think, from a list, and it includes things like only sleeping on the forest floor or
Wow.
only wearing discarded clothes, spending, a year in a great meditating in a graveyard, things like this. And
Gosh.
yeah, I'm very fascinated with all of that because I remember reading Ajahn Chah, who
Mm.
was a mystic, speaking about his experience, or a Buddhist monk, but in this tradition, and speaking about these mystical experiences almost, from basically depreciating or letting his organism, as Nietzsche would put it, burn
Mm,
itself out and become exhausted, going fasting for these long periods of time and spending all this time in isolation.
yeah.
As you say, it's impossible to run an experiment, or not impossible, ethically impossible. But to me, there seems to be good, at least anecdotal evidence that for certain types of people that works. you know, if you
Yeah.
completely
Well,
remove yourself from the world and all of all of your normal drives and
mm,
starve them out. There are just
yeah.
so many stories and traditions about figures like this.
It's a radical way of quitting smoking. Let's put it that
True,
way.
true, true, true. Or
There are
getting
there
out
are
of
easier paths.
right. Well, I mean, I guess yeah. If your goal though is to get out of the wheel of rebirth, it might take more extreme
Mm,
measures. I don't want to
yeah,
smoke in
yeah, for
any
sure.
lifetime ever again. I guess I wanted to move on a little bit and ask you about the economy of bodies, your
Yeah.
talk that you
Excuse me.
gave at the Nietzschean
Mm,
Society. But before we get into that, I just want to ask about the experience of going there a little bit.
mm.
And you touched on it a little bit, but it was held in Belfast. Did people travel from all over the world, or
Yes, yes, they did. In fact, a lot of them, surprisingly, I would say about half the people there were from the United States, which is pretty impressive because that's a 6 or 8 hour flight, and all the other delegates were from Europe, such as myself. So that's kind of an hour on the plane for most people, perhaps 2.5 if you're coming from Italy. Yeah, it was a real international conclave, mainly lecturers and professors and PhD students. As I say, there were three of us there that weren't academics. One was a psychotherapist. I didn't get to meet the other guy. I did try to hunt him down, but I didn't catch him over the course of the weekend. And we went to Queen's University in Belfast, which was absolutely beautiful, grand, I guess Edwardian pile. And so for me, I have to say, I did feel a bit like a fish out of water. But that a really nice community of people, lots of irony there, because as academics, they all know that like Nietzsche had his reservations about academia. What does he say? All that's ever been taught in universities is a critique of words by means of other words. And that was a weekend of critiquing words by means of other words, but totally stimulating. So
he says much harsher things about scholars at other
that's
times.
right.
But
Yeah,
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 but he was one
yeah,
himself as well. So I think
yeah.
a lot of it
That's right.
is a self criticism of his
Yeah.
his earlier days.
He's scathing about everybody. So, maybe it's flattery to be included in all the different groups that
Yeah,
he's
absolutely.
scathing about. But they were really nice people and went for a few Guinnesses at the end of the day and, managed to chat to a few academics about Nietzsche. So that was a bit of a luxury. I mean, I suppose the most challenging thing about the whole weekend, apart from me delivering what really turned into a lecture, and unfortunately, mine was on the last day, so I had to be like really. So I had that hanging over me for the 3 days. Ideally, that would have been done at the start, and then I would have been able to relax a bit more. But it went very well. I'm happy about it. But I did have to cut my cloth to suit the. I don't even know what the end of that expression is, but I had to rewrite my paper, my theory in academic terms and provide copious citations and make sure that all my claims were robustly supported. And that involved a lot of literature searches and reading. And it just reminded me from my master's how much I hate academic writing. It's a very sort of dry, technical process, but it was really valuable for me to apply that kind of academic scrutiny to some of the theories that I'd been developing over the last few months. So all in all, a fantastic experience. I will be going next year. Why don't you think about it, Keegan? I think probably most of those people there would know you. And the next year's is in Athens, the cradle of Western philosophy in Greece. So you might want to consider submitting an abstract yourself when next year comes around.
I just might. I just might. I remember you telling me that about Athens, and I have not
Mm.
been to Greece, so I would love to go. And yeah, for obvious many obvious reasons for anyone who's listened to the podcast for any length of time that going to Greece
Sure.
in and of itself would be a real treat, but then going to Greece to talk about Nietzsche would be
Yeah.
quite something.
I'm going to remind you
Okay, all right, all
next
right.
year. Yeah. Because
Uh,
I'm in the Friedrich Nietzsche Society now, of course, so I get the mail outs and everything, but I'll let you know.
okay, yeah. It's is there a deadline?
No, they've not released any details yet. And
Okay.
being academic, it's a bit slipshod and last minute. These are people who've got like enormous workloads anyway. So there'll be a call for abstracts, I guess, around June of 2026. So plenty of time to think about what you might present.
Yeah. Well, I am writing a book about Nietzsche's view of the Greeks, and that might be
Ah,
a perfect place to take
this
some key idea from that book and present it in the form of a talk.
this
Um,
is fate, Keegan.
yeah, it
Surely.
certainly sounds that way. It certainly sounds that way. Well, in any case, in spite of the fact that it's would Nietzsche say dry as dust academic writing, to the listeners who don't know, you can go and hear the presentation on Jimmy's podcast, and you gave a great lively performance of it that did not sound academic and dry. It sounded very engaging to me. Yeah, let's get into it. So the economy
Hmm.
of bodies. Could you maybe give, just the paragraph long summary of what you were trying to
Yeah.
get across?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, this was me exploring how Nietzsche's notion of the aesthetic sensibility informs our understanding of the development of culture, really, and social structures, but also individual and collective life within civilization. And this is really about Nietzsche's aesthetics and its roots in sexual reproduction. Nietzsche, as you know, and he states this in Truth and Lies, but elsewhere too, in The Will to Power, unpublished writings, there's a few references to this. There's no equal things in existence as far as Nietzsche's concerned. And because there's no equal things, the human animal has evolved to discriminate and evaluate in the struggle to secure life's necessities. And of course, in its natural environment, it instinctively chooses that which is most conducive and optimal for survival, for reproduction. So this is where the sort of Darwinian element comes into it in the evolutionary psychology. So this is will to power in certainly in my interpretation in its physio-psychological instantiation, the endurance and the growth and the development of a genetic lineage in competition with other lineages kind of explains our instincts, our desire to compete and reproduce and nourish ourselves and secure territory and be safe. And the selection of reproductive partners is a domain of choice that obviously has significant evolutionary consequences. We're sexually attracted to characteristics that signal reproductive fitness. And Nietzsche thinks that this sexual responsiveness is the genesis and basis of the aesthetic sensibility per se, representing a preconscious physio-psychological orientation to what he calls ascending life. And we experience this aesthetic sensibility in the feeling of Rausch, which means intoxication in German. And it's a feeling of motivation and creative inspiration. I guess a more colloquial way of putting it would be it's kind of being turned on. Turned on to the point where we sort of straighten up and we start to display ourselves. Perhaps because, imagine you see somebody attractive at a party and suddenly you stand a bit taller and you smooth your hair if you've got any hair. I haven't. And you have these physiological responses, your pupils dilate and what have you.
It reminded me when you were speaking, the way you were speaking about Rausch was of Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche and the will to power as that which pushes the self out beyond itself.
Ah,
And it seemed like just the perfect example of that, of beauty,
mm,
the aesthetic experience as something that sort of establishes the object of your willing in a certain sense, which is, you could
yeah,
say, the other person, but it really is, it refers back to you. It refers back to, what kind of person do I have to
yeah,
become desired by the person that I find beautiful, something like
Yeah.
that. I think that so often what people desire involves a self image. It's not just the object itself, right? The thing
Yeah.
that they're desiring is a new version of themselves, say, with that thing, or what would it take for me to get that thing? What would it take? What would
Mm.
my life be if I achieve this very prestigious, sought after position or career? What would my
Yes.
life look like if I were attractive enough to marry, that beautiful girl over there, something like that? They're really
Yeah.
imagining. It's not just like they're not just desiring for some object, quote unquote, out there.
Mm.
It is an experience that's pushing them beyond where they are.
Well, absolutely. It's that sort of motivating. Well, I think Nietzsche talks in Will to Power around aphorism 800 to about 805. He talks a lot about sex and art and aesthetics and Rausch. And he talks about levity and the sap rising and the feeling of spring. I mean, these are all kind of allusions to what is essentially being like inspired or let's shall we sort of being turned on, but I don't want to be too crude about it. This is about like
Yeah,
getting
I
the
don't think
blood
we have
up.
a word
You
in
see something,
English for it. I don't think we have one
right.
word for it in English,
Mm.
but I see what you're getting at. Yeah.
So, of course, the next like significant event for this animal, this human animal, with its susceptibility to the aesthetic in potential sexual partners, reproductive fitness, as we said, is that according to Nietzsche's history, the human becomes incarcerated within the walls of civilized super communities, what he calls herds. And the animal instincts that can disrupt the integrity of that community have to be systematically curtailed. And obviously, in Genealogy of Morals, he discusses this in great depth. So, severely constrained but irrepressible, the aesthetic impulse has to find expression in diverse, sublimated forms that are not overtly sexual because the sexual is proscribed. And this plasticity, and this is my contention, enabled the capture and repurposing of this aesthetic sensibility by the herd entities themselves for their own ends. So, what I'm hypothesizing is that successful herds economized their members' sublimated sexual energies in order to achieve greater social cohesion by exploiting them in the production of culture, art, religious myth, and values, a definite table of values that serves that whole community. And for me, that's will to power instantiated again, but organizationally, because of course, human herds, human societies, and these super communities, they compete with each other as well for territory and for predominance and appropriate each other, of course. That's colonization, empire building. So human communities compete for just in the same way as individuals do. And those herds with a unified culture do better. And the unified culture, I suggest, comes from the sublimation of their members' repressed sexual energies. I hope that's clear.
There's that one line of Nietzsche's that it escapes me at the moment where he writes it, and I don't think I can quote it verbatim, but he says something to the effect that writing symphonies is another way of having children, something like
Ah,
that.
yes. Yeah,
So
that's right.
he rather directly addresses this
Mm,
sublimation of sexuality, and I believe you touched on it in your lecture, where he says
mm.
that the depths and heights of a man's sexuality like reach up into his very soul, something like this.
That's right.
Uh,
Yeah,
yeah, and
yeah.
so I think he directly recognizes sublimation and its effect to create culture. Would you say then that it's a power that the collective or society has, sublimation?
I would say that the sex drive is a power, and it cannot be contained. And so, if it is contained, if it's repressed, if it's not allowed to express itself, it has to find other routes, and that's what sublimation is. But I saw some videos recently on YouTube. How YouTube occasionally throws things your way, and you end up thinking, "Why am I getting this? This is not the, you know, where's the artificial intelligence that's like analyzing my preferences? But some of these videos are about like, and they're obviously aimed at young men, and they're about like defeating lust, overcoming lust, like controlling your own sexual desire and squashing it down. And they're so moralistic, and I find this like bizarre because even though many of them are not Christian, they definitely seem to be reflecting Christian values. They're sort of crypto-Christian in that they're trying to suggest that lust is like evil or bad or something to be expunged, when really it's like one of the most powerful drives that, in fact, it may be the most powerful drive that human beings have. And so Nietzsche advises, as with all the instincts, economizing those powers, putting them to good use. And that's what sublimation is. It's the redirection of that energy into something productive. So I find it strange that in this day and age, there's like young men who are like worried about like their sexual desire. I mean, of course, there can be pathologies. You can be addicted to porn. You can spend all day masturbating when you could be doing something else more, yeah, more useful, more fulfilling.
Yeah,
But it's
I was going to
yeah,
say there's a
carry on.
billboard on the way to Austin that I just saw driving back from being out of town that says "shackled by lust?" question mark,
Mm,
and it's a picture of somebody's hands on touching a phone, right? Like
yeah.
tapping on their phone, so that they're associating lust with implicitly pornography, porn addiction,
Mm,
and of course the message at the bottom is Jesus will set you free. So it's
yeah.
like it's an explicitly religious. I thought of that immediately when we were talking about defeating lust, and it's like I just saw that billboard. That it's like I
Mm,
think the same thing when I see that, but it you understand why, or I understand why they might take that orientation when, as you say, there's so many people who are not productively sublimating that drive.
mm,
They've been
mm,
given a sort of a really unproductive hedonistic outlet to just
yeah.
satisfy it sort of in the manner of like fast food or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. I mean, I think this like cuts to the sort of heart of the problem that reflects the human condition, which is we've got these energies, we've got these urges, we've got like some kind of desire, and it doesn't really have there's not a lot of very interesting ways you can work with that. Oh yeah, you can, aspire for career success or to make lots of money or, get a nice house in a nice neighborhood and a new car every 2 years and 2.4 children. And I actually think the life script that we're offered is like so uninspiring and so mundane that um, people take refuge in like simple, accessible pleasures like food and drugs or masturbation or even sex with a partner if you're lucky, because the pursuit of pleasure just seems to be all we can do. That seems to be all that's available to us. But this is what's really interesting about Nietzsche, I think. He sees the value in suffering, the fact that suffering can be made sacred. And it's not about just trying to escape suffering and take refuge in comfort and safety and, the most base hedonic pleasures. There's something much more interesting we can all be doing with our lives. But society furnishes with a pathway that doesn't really allow for that, I feel.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I've spoken about that quite a bit on the show over the years. Oftentimes, we'll be presented with this story about, I would just say in, sort of frustratingly vague terms, modernity,
Mm.
modern liberal society, something like that, that presents a raised standard of living and quality of life in sort of these objective utilitarian terms.
Yeah.
But it's what I think is was really it was one of those light bulb moments for me with Nietzsche was the understanding of pain and pleasure as means rather than ends. As
Yeah.
you say, that
Hmm.
suffering could be used for a kind of energy, pleasure could be used for a kind of energy. The sex drive could be a powerful source of energy. Um,
Mm.
but if you turn any one of those into ends, I
Yeah.
think so. People say, "Well, what's wrong with that?" And I think we see exactly the malaise that we experience now. The widespread anxiety and depression and all of these really heightened mental pathologies that exist in these societies with the highest standard of living that we've ever seen.
Mm.
It shows that there's something fundamentally that I don't want to just say unsatisfying. It's like when you're seeking something that is a means and
Mm.
that is not in itself an ends on some deep,
Yeah.
perhaps evolutionary level. You'll always, quote unquote, know that it has to be for something or it's meaningless, would be one way to put
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And I think even if we go back, say, in the American context, to the days of, the last great moment, the great American myth that modern American society is sort of founded on, many would say, is World War II. And so, we can imagine like the famous poster of Uncle Sam pointing, "I want you." When you're
Mm.
working in the factory, you're not just producing capital efficiency or economic value for some company that, at the end of the day is just going to be used to, again, provide us with more utilitarian pleasures so everyone can
Mm.
live a more hedonic existence. Like, no, you're contributing to a war economy that's defending freedom.
Mm.
And, whatever someone might think about that story of like, oh, of course, there's always wartime propaganda, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, that gives a reason for being that's far, far more compelling. And I
Mm.
think when we look to older societies where there's a conception that perhaps you're serving a king who was chosen by God,
Hmm.
or you're engaged in a struggle with another civilization that has the wrong values, you have the right ones. Even if these are all illusions from the Nietzschean perspective, right?
Yeah.
You see how they're using pain and pleasure as means. They're using all of these things as means to this end, at least in terms of how the value system is experienced. And it allowed people to live in actually far, we might say objectively speaking, worse conditions and be
Hmm.
on the whole, at least it seems, more fulfilled, if not happier in the vulgar sense, we
Yeah,
might say.
I completely agree with that, and I completely relate to it. I feel like the condition of modernity is such that it's all about means, but there isn't really an end. So, people laud, especially in the personal growth, self-help space that, my project's concerned with, people laud productivity, but productivity is not an end. It's a means to an end. Productive towards what? What is it? What is the goal here? What is the holy grail that you're pursuing by productivity? And it's the same with hard work. Like hard work as like a good in itself rather than a means to some good. And even money, people might say, well, yeah, but that's how you end up with money and end up rich and comfortable. But money is a means as well. Rich for what? I think Nietzsche actually says that. He definitely says free for what? Freedom is a means to something. What is it a means to? Money money is power. Yeah, but what are you going to do with it? I actually, I got to a philosophy group on a Wednesday here in Brighton, and there was one guy who it was a recent acquaintance, and I got on with him quite well. And I went to a family barbecue of his. We were sort of becoming friends, I guess, tentatively. And then he was speaking about his ambition and his dream, actually, that was the word that he used. And he says, "My dream is to be a millionaire." And I was just thinking, that seems like the most emptiest dream I've ever heard anybody. Why do you want to be a millionaire for what? Kind of, even somebody who says, because I want to make my family comfortable. Yeah, okay, you can understand that. But just a number is your dream. I mean, it just seemed like so bankrupt. And then I think about like there's in York there's this a building called York. It's called York Minster. It's like a cathedral, an enormous um, Gothic cathedral, absolutely beautiful. And I think it was built in the 12th century. And that cathedral took, and I'm going to pluck a number out of the air, but it's something like this. It took 260 years to build. So the people who started building that in the 12th century, whose life expectancy was probably 40, never saw the end result. And they knew they were never going to see the end result. And then their children, who probably worked on the project as well, because people in those days didn't travel far from the village where they were born. And then their children, I mean, there was maybe 5 or 6 generations of people all working to bring about this incredible project. And I imagine that they probably had a real sense of fulfillment in that. It was transcendent. It wasn't just about them and their well-being and their comfort. It was to the glory of God. It had an absolute value above and beyond any individual existence. And that is something that we completely don't have at all these days, I would say, and are poorer for it.
I would agree with that. And I think it's why I found your talk very interesting for that very, or it relating that back to this, because to go back to the whole issue of, say, extirpation, emasculation versus sublimation, and the issue of, the people, we might say the people who are trying to help young men these days, right? There are
Mm.
some who will take that tact of the emasculation, as Nietzsche would say, pluck out the eye that offends thee, um, defeat your lust, something like that. And then we sort of have the red pill guys like Andrew Tate and you know Bronze Age pervert who are sort of like, yes,
Yeah.
be a savage tiger like man who takes what he wants and
Mm.
lives out this sort of sexual fantasy or something like that. And what it strikes me, that's the issue that I've always had, is that that seems far more honest about dealing with the reality of the power of the sexual impulse, but it doesn't seem to have a story akin to it.
Mm.
It seems to be taking one part of Nietzsche, right, but not addressing the death of God and the
Mm.
centrality of this idea that there really is no replacement for that, as you put it, absolute
Mm.
value that was held over humankind. And I just see so often modern self-help or something, whatever we would want to call it, doesn't seem to address itself to that fact. It ends up sort of referring us back to the modern utilitarian hedonic values in a way. It's
Yeah.
just sort of like, let me give you the successful strategies to more ruthlessly and ambitiously pursue that. But
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to orient us in such a way that really lifts people above that. I don't know
Mm.
what you would call it. Again, the modern malaise. It's, you have to use these very general and vague terms because you're
Yeah.
talking about something that's so huge. It's almost hard to encapsulate it in a word.
Well, I feel that kind of like personal success and domination. I feel like that's kind of like a means as well, not an end. We're not animals. We're not the Homeric nobles. Despite the fantasies of some of these commentators, and I think Nietzsche's very clear that the real end for free spirits and for exceptional people is the elevation of human culture. I think he's really invested in that, in art and the aesthetic and even the creation of new values. That's an artistic project. And being that, the post-Enlightenment, we live in a world where God is dead. There's still lots of religious people around, but even the religious people tend to be nominally religious, not attending. I mean, it's probably different in the US. I know you've got some, quite strident Christians in the US, but over here, people who, church attendances are appalling, and very few people seem to live in alignment with Christian values in any genuine sense.
Well,
But
and
I,
to
but
can I interject something very,
sure,
very,
please do.
very briefly? Is that there is quite a bit of zealous religiosity in the United States, but a lot of it is somewhat farcical in a way. And just to give an
Yeah,
example right off the top of my head, when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, we had a news anchor saying, I think when he goes to heaven, God will ask for his autograph."
yeah.
And
Oh my God.
and I was thinking, I was like, that's the kind of statement that in
Yeah,
certain periods of time could get you executed for heresy,
yeah.
right? And that's what I mean by, it's like there are people who are very religious, but it's almost a silly sort of,
Mm,
I don't know if I quite have the words to describe it or if I have fully formed my
yeah,
thoughts on it, but it's not genuine. There's
yeah.
something very, uh, I think the Catholics would say that they've absorbed too much of the American culture into their Christianity.
Mm,
Because the Catholics always have to like walk this line between how much of the local culture do you capitulate to versus, because they're trying to sort of establish themselves throughout the entire world and be able to work within any culture. So like when Matteo Ricci goes to China, he says, I'm going to learn Confucian philosophy and rituals in
mm.
order to spread Catholicism and all these things. But you can't go native, right? Sorry, I said it
Yeah,
was a brief interjection, but anyway, I would just say I think even the very zealot, a lot of people look at America and say God's not dead in America, but I don't think
Mm,
they're worshiping the same God, or they don't have the same conception
yeah.
of spirituality.
Yeah, I feel that, and I do tend to avoid politics because like my ambit is like individuals and like individual ambition, not ambition, aspiration, individual personal growth and development, and really what's at the core of it is, yeah, of course everybody wants to be more successful in life and have a bit more money and have good fulfilling relationships and feel stimulated and that their life is significant. But I think the real problem that Nietzsche tackles is the sort of quiet nihilism of everyday life. I mean, this is what it means when he says God is dead. This is the post-Enlightenment situation where there is no absolute value, no absolute meaning. And I'm going to use that word, but what is the logical aspiration for a species that's lost its faith in some kind of transcendental God? Well, it's the elevation of its own type, which is, of course, for Nietzsche, what he calls the Übermensch. That is, in a world where there is no transcendence, the only this world transcendence that a species could aim at is the elevation of its own type. So I feel like that was his replacement for aspirations to religious piety and um, fulfillment in the next life. But I find it strange that in the United States with like the Christian nationalists, that for me, the idea of a Christian nationalist is an oxymoron because
I
Christianity
agree.
is universal. That's the whole point. I mean, how do you reconcile yourself with the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is the crux of the entire New Testament, as far as I can see, is like it's not just about your tribe anymore. It's about everybody. Everyone's included in the kingdom of God. So there's some funny old tensions there, I would say.
I would agree. I would say yes. You had a sense of quality or value as biological prior to Jesus, at least in the Western context, and
Mm,
that a very beautiful thing that comes out of that is the idea, ideological or spiritual, you might say, in the German sense of Geist, or
mm,
spiritual value with Jesus, something that transcends where your nation or where you're from or who you are, your ancestors, right? The whole
yeah.
life path that's been laid out for you. And I think that, as Nietzsche says, with the master and slave morality, and all higher and more complex cultures, both are intertwined even within the same heart. So perhaps that's
Mm,
why you have these contradictory ideologies like Christian nationalism, where they feel both of those poles within them. But
mm,
that's what's so brilliant about Nietzsche's work is that he doesn't affect a reconciliation. He says, no, indeed, this is a
yeah.
true dichotomy. These are truly in tension. And
Mm,
one of the things I actually to pivot really quickly, although it's on the same sort of topic because you mentioned the elevation of one's own type and the Übermensch,
mm,
I wanted to ask you about. I believe you used the term like the superorganism for the herd.
yeah. Yeah.
That's a different vision of what the not perhaps the elevation of the human type would be, but
Mm,
perhaps what the best thing for humanity would be. And as you
mm,
say, like logically speaking, quote unquote, the thing would be the elevation of our type from perhaps the evolutionary standpoint, right? But many would say, no, logically, it is actually the society we've been describing in which everyone can sort of be have a comfortable existence and have their needs
mm,
met.
yeah.
And um, I know it involves. I believe you say it's sort of a false organism, the superorganism,
Well,
or
it's a pseudo entity, isn't it?
pseudo entity. Right, right, right.
Or a
Could you
pseudo
explain that a
organism.
little bit?
Yeah. So I guess if you think about like human beings in their original wilderness state, perhaps pre-conscious, pre-language, um, the evidence is that they lived in small communities of maybe 20 or 30 individuals who were all related to one extent or another because um, if you live in a community for a couple of generations, you're that small, you're all going to be related at some point. So they were quite shockingly inbred, and there were ways and means that those communities got around that, in particular through um, um, waging war on their neighboring tribes and stealing reproductively
Right,
viable
bride
females.
kidnapping,
Exactly that.
old
Exactly.
storied tradition.
So that's how you maintain like genetic integrity and avoid inbreeding in those little communities. Um, but of course, the bigger your community, the more successful you're going to be in overwhelming your neighbors and stealing their resources and taking their territory and what have you. So natural selection would favor bigger communities. So, in order to build bigger communities, you need to be able to bring different tribes together. Now, that's a problem because, like most social species, they're most intolerant of members of the same species to whom they're not directly related. You know, you see this in chimpanzees, like, incredibly violent exchanges. And that makes perfect sense because who who constitutes the greatest competition for your survival and the survival of your offspring? Well, it's an organism with exactly the same needs as you. So that hostility makes sense. But if you imagine that once language emerges and human communities can organize themselves to some extent, they can actually have a plan. They can actually have specialized roles, like you might be a chaser in the hunt and I might be an ambusher. So language enables like sophisticated organization such that you can be better at hunting, but you can also be better at waging war on other human communities. And once you've got language and consciousness, you've also got foresight because that's what a plan necessitates. You need to be able to hypothesize about what's going to happen in the future such that you can make some choices about how you're going to try and bring about the ends that you want. Um, so I hypothesize that at some point, and there is some good evidence for this actually. I did a bunch of literature searches for my paper. I hypothesized that what probably happened is that some tribe realized that instead of killing everybody and stealing the reproductively viable females, it was actually more profitable to just take all their stuff and let them continue to exist and then come back next year and take all their stuff again. So what we end up with is vassals and empires and ultimately slavery because the dominant tribe can become a full-time warrior caste, taking over yet more and more neighboring tribes and extract tributes from its vassals and delegate to them the drudge work that they would be doing otherwise. And that's how you end up with small little, in my take, that's how you end up with small little kin societies becoming these super communities where different human genetic lineages mingle in like a bigger community that can be hundreds, thousands, even millions. But what's crucial for that, what's absolutely crucial is because of the natural hostility, the natural kin affection, natural kin altruism, which, if you like, is the sort of most primitive morality. Like you care, you've evolved to care about your children, to care about your brother to some extent, to care and share food perhaps with, the extended family. That needs to be, um, the word is exacted, which you don't really come across very often, but it means like hijacked and enforced such that you extend that altruism to a bigger community with whom you are not genetically related. And that's, for me, is like the beginning of morality, like the codification of morality. Because prior to that, you didn't need an explicit morality. You felt it as affection for people who shared the same genes as you, the people around you.
Right, it's an imperative from within. It's not an abstract imperative or something that comes from a civil structure or social structure or something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think initially it's just enforced through violence. That's what Nietzsche says in Genealogy of Morals, is like you impose order on this super community by forcing them to repress their instincts, which includes the sexual impulse, but it also includes aggression. People are not allowed to be aggressive, and you can imagine that the masters, would pluck out troublemakers, execute them, exile them, you name it, beat them into submission. And so you've got like an enforced peace within this community. But over time, what happens is because the sexual impulse is sublimated into culture is that you create a whole mythology and a system of values that extols a moral unity within that community. We're all part of the same community. We have a history together. The gods decreed it that it should be like this. And the ancestors, who were probably gods as well, they decided that this is the way the world would be, with the aristocracy at the top and you vassals at the bottom. And essentially, a culture and a system of values is enforced and ultimately just socialized into every generation, such that they have a loyalty to people who in the wild would have been like the worst kind of enemy.
So the prototypical example from antiquity would be of perhaps the early form of this would be, say, the Spartans, where they ritually declare war on the Helots, their slave people, every year, and they are allowed as the sort of the masters to go out, and I believe as a rite of passage of
Mm,
growing, becoming into adulthood, the youth would be allowed to go and hunt and kill some of the Helots. But violence only goes in one direction, right? Because
yeah,
the Helots are then being sort of enculturated to be a slave ethnicity that will do the labor while they can be the aristocrats, people of leisure and of violence.
yeah,
Um, but then you might say, as this progresses, eventually at the end of antiquity, we have, say, the Roman Empire,
mm,
where you eventually have people who were of a lineage that, would come from a vassal people or slave
mm,
people, like the Severan dynasty.
mm,
Septimius Severus, it was called the African Emperor, with Syrian
mm,
blood and North African blood.
yeah,
And yeah, you see this complete transformation over the existence of the Roman Empire. I mean, many transformations, but
yeah,
one of the big ones is this transformation into society in the modern sense, perhaps the move from society in the older sense of the kin group. It's not really anything that resembles modern morality or society,
hmm, yeah.
into something that resembles it in the way that we experience it.
Yeah, Rome's a really good example actually, because I think most societies are kind of they have a myth of being an extended clan, that they all stem from like common ancestors who decreed what society would be like. But the Romans are interesting because their founding myth with Romulus and Remus is that they kind of were immigrants who arrived at Rome and established Rome, and so Rome has got a culture, always had a culture of like anyone could be a Roman, anyone could be a citizen. It wasn't as ethnically based as a lot of other civilizations, and so that was quite and in some ways maybe that paved the way for Christianity being like a universal religion, because Rome was universal in terms of anyone could aspire to be a citizen, with all things being equal. And then by contrast with that, like if you look at like one of the oldest social systems in the world, which is the caste system, the Hindu caste system. People were untouchables or at the bottom, or there were Brahmins at the top. And that was decreed religiously. People believed that it was divinely ordained that they would belong to the social stratum that they were part of. And part of it, I mean, you probably know more about this because you're really au fait with Eastern spirituality, but people believed that they were working out their own karma, and that's why they'd been placed in the social strata that they had.
Yes, and that wasn't as the understanding prior to Gautama Buddha was of karma was not quite the same, and dharma was
Mm,
not the same as the Buddhists would later give it. That the idea of like kind of having to work off your karma,
mm,
something you want to, your bad karma, right, and acquire good
yeah.
karma in order to. It was more like that is your it, that every action of not only yourself but your ancestors, or you might say your previous incarnations in the world, all have consequences which you have to inherit, in the sense that it could even be across lifetimes, and that for
Mm,
whatever reason it's right for you. It's actually a very brilliant life philosophy, I think, that whatever station in society you're in, yes, there might be in the relative sense, right? Like if you're an untouchable, we might imagine somebody from a higher caste might come by and say something nasty
mm,
towards you, get out of my way, something like that. but on the higher level, that all of you are exactly where you are supposed to be, and that if
Mm,
you fulfill your function properly, it says a lot of this in the Bhagavad Gita, that you could have two enemies who are destined to destroy one another, but on a superordinate level, on the level of like Brahman, they're, Brahman can look at that and say they're both fulfilling their karma. They're both carrying
right.
out exactly what they're supposed to be doing.
Mm,
The brilliance of that is that it's sort of, I don't know, it could allow even somebody at the lowest caste level to feel as though there's some sort of superordinate significance to their existence.
yeah,
It's part of
right.
this whole play of forces in the existence.
Sure. I mean, it's a kind of thing. It's really interesting because to us in the West, with our values, it's really appalling. And like, the Hindu caste system has been outlawed in India, and that's principally to do with pressure, like from the West. But you can see how, like, even the most like impoverished and denigrated social station, if it's got existential meaning, in some ways it can be more fulfilling than, I mean, I say this and like I feel terrible because like I live in the West and it's not for me to say that somebody enjoys their station in life or not. Kind of who knows? Only they can say. But like the idea of I think Nietzsche says it as well. Like people strive to be a function, to have a place. People want a
Right.
place. They want a justification for their existence. They want acceptance and a role. And like I said earlier on, um, sometimes that freedom is more of a burden than a blessing.
Well,
I
and
mean, we all go
we
ahead.
have our version of it in the West as well, the blessedness of poverty and so on.
Right.
So it's not entirely foreign to us. And by the way, I would say you say the caste system's been abolished, and I've said that when talking about Nietzsche's comments in the Manu Law book. But I'll have commenters from who are Indian will say
Mm.
no, it's very much still exists. It's
Yeah, yeah,
more implicit and
yeah.
subtle. It's not. It can't be official. But even they'll even take it with them to the Western world.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, which
I,
is fascinating to me, but it's a world I don't really fully
yeah.
understand.
I kind of I actually worked with worked with quite a few Indian people up in London when I was working with the National Health Service. And my manager was Indian, and she was a terrible manager actually. And like I had an Indian colleague, and we were discussing the caste system, and he was like, "Oh yeah, manager. Yeah, that was the first thing she asked me at the job interview, like which caste I was in, because she was in the Brahmins, the topmost." And so it's still a thing. Even outside of India, it's very much a thing.
Yeah, I can't imagine if you, especially if you immigrated, sort of trying to get away from all that, and then you're getting asked in an interview in England what your
Mm,
caste was. It must be
yeah,
a nightmare for
sure.
some. For some. I want to talk to you about the topic that you're going to be covering in your final episode, which we've
Mm,
already spoken about to some
mm,
extent, which is the will to power. We've
hmm.
sort of spoken of the will to power as it relates to social structures, the creation of culture, sublimation, all of these things. But you sort of you said you want to present will to power comprehensively, I believe you said, or sort of
Yeah,
exhaustively, which
yeah.
I recently had a conversation with Joe Foley, and he said, "Well, I see at least three ways to see the will to power," and
Hmm.
he gave me his, and we spoke about it a little bit. But I was reflecting after that conversation that those certainly aren't the only three. So,
Mm,
if it's possible, could you maybe give sort of an overview of maybe all of the different ways you look at will to power, or
yeah,
how your view is structured, perhaps? Is there like
sure.
one primary lens and sub lenses, or just fundamentally just different ways you can look at it? I guess I would also ask you, for someone who said that this is so time consuming and involved, how do you intend to accomplish such a task?
Mm. Well, yeah, I mean, there are three commonly held interpretations of will to power, each of differing scope. So, and this is amongst academia in the secondary literature. So, first of all, there's the interpretation that it's just something about human psychology, about how human beings like strive for power, and that's an implicit dynamic within human psychology. And then there's a slightly wider one which says that will to power is common to all organic life. So it's not just human beings, but all animals and even plants exhibit will to power. And the textbook, I don't know if you've ever mentioned this, Keegan, but the textbook illustration of that is like when you see like a jungle speeded up and you see all the plants clambering over each other, striving towards the light and striving for space. And that's a really
A little
vivid
bit on the
illustration.
the Sipo Matador passage.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then the most broadest interpretation is that it's an ontological principle. And I tend to adhere to that one because for me it makes perfect sense. Certainly as far as my research has uncovered it. And Nietzsche does allude to will to power as being the fundamental principle of existence. He does it in his published work, but not in lots of places. And he certainly does it in his unpublished notes. And I think that interpretation of will to power makes much more sense than the others. Because, and it is comprehensive because as a fundamental principle, a fundamental ontological in principle, it explains everything. And I think that's one of the reasons why people reject it out of hand because, theories of everything sound a bit grandiose and overambitious, but will to power in this interpretation, as I read it, it's not a force, it's just what happens. It's just the way the world works. It's like gravity, it's inexorable. It's just the way things occur in our reality, certainly from the human perspective anyway, which is the only perspective we ever get. So to break will to power down, we need to analyze, what is will and then what is power. So will Nietzsche's contention, I think, is will is just everything that happens. It's all change, it's all becoming. And this goes beyond our intentional, purposive will. And in fact, our will is just a development and ramification of a more fundamental form of will. And he explores that in Beyond Good and Evil 36. So he's actually will, as we understand it, our sort of volition, is actually skeptical about that. And in Twilight of the Idols, I've got a quote here from it's the section on reason, number 5. Quote, at the beginning, there stands the great and fatal error of thinking that the will is something effective, that will is an ability. Today we know that it is just a word, unquote. And there's a bunch of other quotes that support that same contention. But what he's saying there is you think your will does things, but in actual fact, it doesn't. It's determined. It happens just like a rock rolling down a hill happens. And so in this picture, the universe is a roiling, self-sufficient household without losses or gains, as he says in Will to Power 1067. And it's all bound together in love. And in Zarathustra, he actually says, quote, everything chained, entwined together, everything in love, unquote. So this is a picture of a deterministic universe that's where everything is interconnected and everything that happens because of everything else. It's a unity and it's also a multiplicity at the same time. And this multiplicity, this unity is a multiplicity of forces that vie with each other for survival and supremacy. But prior to human consciousness, they do it mindlessly and without purpose. And he says again in that Will to Power 1067, quote, the universe is a play of forces and waves of forces, at the same time one and many, unquote. And recently in your gay science exposition, you were talking about that particular passage where he talks about waves in a
Will and
very
wave, yeah.
enigmatic way. Yeah.
Yeah. We are of the same nature, you and I.
Yeah,
Speaking to the
that's right.
waves. Yeah.
That's right. So so I attempted to kind of like find a proof of this, right? That our will is just like gravity or a plant reaching for the sun or a rock rolling down a hill. So if we sort of analyze will, human will is that's conscious, it's purposive, but human beings, I think this is not controversial. We have unconscious wills too, don't we? We have like things that we strive for that we're not conscious of. Perhaps as reflexes or a neurosis or an instinct, sexual attraction might be that we might be sexually attracted to somebody without really being aware of it, but other people can see it. It's abundantly obvious to other people. And with a neurosis, it might be that a parent told us we would never amount to anything. And so we find that we self-sabotage ourselves, even though we may have forgotten that inciting incident that made us feel that we don't deserve good things. And then there's things like passive aggression. So I think it's pretty safe to assert that not all will is conscious. Some of it is unconscious. So if there's unconscious will as instinct, um, I think we can assume that animals have will too, even in animals that don't have consciousness. So sea anemone, for instance, or have you heard of the sea squirt quoted by Daniel Dennett? It's a creature that kind of has an environmental awareness and a consciousness until it's sexually mature, and then it latches onto a rock and it digests its own brain. So
Yes, I have heard of this. I have heard of this. Yeah.
yeah, so even those animals have it would be difficult to suggest that those animals don't have will, right? Okay, but they're not conscious and they're also not purposive. They're not aiming at anything like a sea anemone isn't really aiming. It has no telos, has no purpose. It operates on stimulus and response. So that's will without purpose, without consciousness. And then if you go further, you can talk about organic molecules like DNA and RNA and their complex self-replicating behavior. They look like they're doing something. They look like they're trying to do something. They look like they've got will, but we would never say that they're conscious and they've got intentions and that they will things. And then, of course, the rudiments of those organic molecules are pre-organic molecules and inorganic molecules. And so will, as we understand it, seems to be just a feature of physiology that's structurally complex. But complexity is a sliding scale, right? So less complex structures seem to have will, and then you get down to what are really the most basic structures that do seem to accumulate, and a rock rolling down the hill. So let me put it to you like this: the rock rolling down the hill wants to roll down the hill. Now that sounds like an absurd statement, but that's because you're thinking that the rock's wanting is not like human wanting. It's the other way around. Human wanting is like the rocks wanting. It's just got a few extra whistles and bells that we call consciousness and sentience. So it's just as determined, it's just as inevitable and necessary. It's just that we have an experience alongside it, whereas the rock doesn't.
Yes, I think that was the perfect way to put it because you could say that what Nietzsche is often criticizing in the work of people like Schopenhauer was that he analogized that the rock wanted to roll down the hill, but he would say the rock wants to roll down the hill in the same way that you want things
Mm,
consciously, right? That
right.
Nietzsche felt that that's what he was doing by uh, taking the will and
Mm,
imputing it onto the inorganic world. But
yeah.
I think I would agree with your interpretation that Nietzsche is taking will, quote unquote, he in the inorganic sense, which can
Yeah.
be very hard to grasp. But I like the way you did it, kind of regressing right to the
Mm,
most simple form and
yeah.
saying, no, that's actually the same way that you will. It's actually the
Mm,
other way around. That your
right.
will is fundamentally not inorganic because you are still organic, but in the same, we might say it again, as he says of the waves, right?
Yeah.
We're of
Yeah,
the
for
same
sure.
race, you and I. I think that's quite brilliant way of putting it. That we're what it reminds me of too is Spinoza's thrown stone. What he
Mm,
says about in his arguments against free will is that he says if you were to throw a stone, imagine the stone is conscious. What it would tell you is, of course, what I want to do is to fly through the air at precisely this arc
mm,
and land here.
hmm.
And that's because I could imagine there could be an objection to saying, why do people have these conscious this experience of intention. And just as
Mm,
you say, because we have consciousness and sentience, we
yeah.
tell ourselves the story of intention. And that the other thing that's interesting about it is that even though Nietzsche dispenses with free will, he tends to see intention and the fact that we experience a conscious intention sort of
Mm,
a healthy thing because
mm,
it reveals that it's a an inversion of intensity, as he says, the most intense impulses you have, where your will to power is strongest. That's what you're going
yeah.
to experience as this is my intention. This is
Yeah.
my will.
Yeah. Yeah. So you don't have will, you are will. And
Yeah,
like, yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important distinction to make. And for me, the free will, the free will experience stems from like two things essentially. Firstly, the phenomenology of rational consciousness, the fact that we can recall things and that we can hypothesize about the future and we can imagine alternatives. I mean, these are adaptions. We can all see how these adaptations are going to be beneficial for an organism that's trying to survive and reproduce. If you can remember what happened last time, you can learn from that, right? If you can hypothesize what might happen in the future, you can think about different courses of action that might yield different results, some of which might be especially advantageous. So, but like even that rational deliberation is determined. I mean, you get the compatibilists arguing that because we can reason, we must have free will. But reason relies on coherence. It relies on the succession of ideas that the fact that they're all linked together and make sense. It's absolutely deterministic reason. But like the phenomenology, because we can, and I think you touched on this when you talked about somebody studying or not studying and staying up playing Call of Duty all night, and then the next morning they fail a test and they're like, if only I'd studied instead. And they can even run a little movie in their head of like them staying at home and studying instead. But of course, that couldn't have happened because all the determinants would have had to be different. But the benefit of the memory is that next time that might create a new determinant that means that they do study instead of playing Call of Duty all night instead. So there's something about the fact that we can imagine different realities makes us think that there can be different realities. And I think that's completely wrong. I don't even think free will is a coherent theory. It collapses under the most cursory scrutiny.
I would agree. It's very difficult to even define exactly what people are saying when they say that you have free will, and it has to almost hinge on some sort of magical explanation. I
That's
mean,
right.
they might
Yeah.
say in scientific, well, it's unexplained, or but just the fact that it's not fully explained doesn't mean. But
Mm,
you are positing an a causal
yeah.
cause in that
That's
sense.
right. That's right.
And it's, as Nietzsche, of course, pointed out, there's a great similarity to religious claims about God and
Yeah.
the spirit that are able to
Yes.
be a causal causes. The will to power is such a profound idea precisely because of the fact that it is this conception of will that's not
Yeah.
it is subversive to the normal definition of will, of free
Mm,
will, volition in that sense.
yeah. I mean, there's a second reason why free will is like so reinforced as I call it a noble lie. It's a noble lie that we need to maintain for the integrity of our societies because our economics, our democratic system, contract law, criminal justice, and our morality itself is they all presuppose it.
Sure.
Our entire society is founded on it. We
Yeah.
can't afford not to have free will. And so it's continually reinforced by making people blameworthy and culpable for the things that they've done. But as Nietzsche says, nobody is morally responsible, but we're terrified of the consequences of people understanding that. And I guess that's kind of reasonable.
Yeah. There's the super organism once again stepping in to,
That's right. Yeah.
yeah, economize all of this.
Integrity. That's
Yeah.
right. The integrity of the organism is absolutely paramount. But you were asking about will to power, and I kind of I sort of analysed the will bit, but the power bit comes next. So I mean, I think and I struggled with this question for a long time actually. What is power? And the definitions are quite ambiguous, actually. I actually think power is a value judgment. Something that's powerful for you might not be for me. You might be powerfully attracted to a person who I have no attraction to whatsoever, or you might find an order particularly powerful, or you might be a sergeant in the military and you're powerful to the platoon of men that you lead, but compared to a brigadier, you're not powerful at all. So, powerful is a matter of perspective, a value judgment, as I say.
Well, it also involves the way I think about this is Nietzsche's comments in the Antichrist, where he says that power is the overcoming of resistance. He links it
Mm,
specifically to that. The
yeah.
feeling that resistance is being overcome. You could say the
Yes.
feeling is the epiphenomenon. That's how you would. It's not necessarily the will to power itself, quote unquote, but it's the feeling that accompanies,
Yeah.
perhaps. That's what accompanies the object of our desires or of our wills. And I think
Sure.
the reason why it's fundamentally different for everyone and never pre-established is because, I mean, for example, as a musician myself, what does it look like for me to overcome resistance? It could be practicing uh, new scales and modes that I haven't practiced yet and becoming incredibly familiar with those. But
Yeah.
even within, compared to other musicians, it might be very different what constitutes my overcoming of my challenges that just
Yeah.
give me a feeling of power. One of the things, there's a one of those guitar virtuosos, Steve Vai, and he was practicing his alternate picking patterns because he realized he wasn't quite as good as some of the other virtuosos,
Mm.
and at that particular technique anyway. And he drilled it every day, and he worked really hard on it. And then he came to a realization that and I forget exactly what this principle is called, but I mean, in colloquial terms, you would just say playing to your strengths. It's sort of like,
Mm.
that's not my strength. What I should be doing is actually throwing even more time into the areas where I'm already strong to just
Mm.
blow everyone out of the water at that. And so I'm going to really lean into my sort of staccato picking.
Right.
And so that's what I find interesting. And then, but so it's like even within the world of musicians, what might be power in terms of the technique or getting a bigger audience or getting on a bigger tour or something like that. And then you might even have all these different branching paths within that. But then you zoom out a
Yeah.
little bit and you move over from like the musician to a painter. They're both artists, but they have a
Mm.
completely different set of things that would represent power to them.
Yeah.
And then you move
Yeah.
over to another thing, finance and psychologist, all of these things. And so, yeah, when people ask what is power, it's never pre-established. It's
No.
always,
No.
um, I mean,
Perspectival.
right, exactly.
Mm.
You can't ever say it's this
Mm.
because once you sort of lay hold of it like that, you're. I mean, I think there's the how would I put it? The impulse to want to do that. I think to give that sort of concrete definition for that is to people are always trying to take Nietzsche's philosophy and turn it into a prescriptive set of ethics.
Mm.
And sort of the thing you were saying at the very beginning of the conversation that Nietzsche really, a thorough and sober reading of Nietzsche would reject this idea
Mm.
of this take personal responsibility. It's so funny because you're talking about the rejection of willpower as the driver of what changes people's behavior at the beginning of the conversation. People would say willpower that contains two of the words in will to power, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet it's like it's not the case that I require a great deal of willpower for me to practice the guitar.
No.
It's those things like that are where I get the feeling of power of overcoming resistance.
Yeah.
For the
Yeah.
most
Yeah. Yeah.
part, I don't have to be pushed. I don't have
Yep.
to have some voice or some abstract ideal telling me I have to
Mm.
do it.
Right. Yeah. So you remind me of there's this philosopher, Nietzsche scholar called John Richardson, who I love, is one of my favorites for sure. And he talks about will to power as growth in control. And it made me think about your friend there practicing. Um, and there's that hedonic element of it. It's a growth control that feels good. But when I was looking at like will to power, I was trying to think about what is power objectively. So not the experience of having power, but the experience of perceiving power, witnessing it, seeing it. And for me, power is effects with that are significant. And like Nietzsche says, everything just is its effects. That's all the thing is. That makes perfect sense, kind of its effects on everything else
Lightning
constitute
is the flash.
exactly that. But because if everything is its effects and perspectives differ, everything is power to one degree or another, because everything has effects. It's just a matter of how powerful those effects are to any particular perceiver. So what matters is its significance, the significance of its effects to us relative to our interests. And that's why power is a value judgment. It's in the eye of the beholder because different people can find different things powerful. So power is something about a human perspective, I think, and so, like survival, for instance, is a form of power because if you're going to have effects, well, then you need to exist to have those effects, right? So, the most basic form of power and the prerequisite for other forms of power is to exist and to keep existing. And so, of course, that's how we stray into Darwinian evolution by natural selection. And this sort of impulse to exist and keep existing is not purposive until it gets to complex animals like human beings. And then even here, like survival is instrumental towards more developed forms of power, the economization of power, accumulation and its expression, that growth in control, that development and domination and so for me, like what will to power is, if power is a value judgment and will is everything that happens, will to power is everything that happens with that force or form which endures right now in this moment being the only reality, has, as proven by its very existence, vanquished or appropriated those forms or forces which no longer exist. But although everything is power in expression, the perception of it is subjective. The powerful is discerned by us and evaluated as powerful relative to our own power interests. So we ask ourselves, is this phenomenon a threat or is it an opportunity? Does that make sense, Keegan? No, that's quite a
Yeah, no,
yeah.
but
Oh, okay, great.
I think I'm on the same page with you on many of these things already. The way you're explaining it is, I think I really admire it because it's something I've struggled to put forward myself. That I get on some intuitive level, but how do you convey to someone that
Yeah,
everything is power?
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's the fact that everything is its effect. Everything has an effect. Everything.
Mm.
Yeah. So I think we are on the same page, and I'm very much looking forward to
Oh, great.
your episode on this as well.
Oh,
Um,
great. Oh, wow.
is it
Yeah,
going to
well,
be an
thank you.
epic length?
Well, it's kind of looking like it's going to be maybe a 2 hour episode, which I'm okay with because I did promise a bumper episode. But what I'm trying to do is break it up and make it easy to grasp. I mean, in some ways, like making these things easy to grasp is for my own comprehension. Because, like
Yeah,
you, I have an intuition about these things, and I can't quite nail what it is that what I believe, what I feel. And so it's by trying to pull it apart and explain it to somebody else that you actually come to grasp it yourself. I'm sure
true.
you're familiar with that feeling. So yeah, it's going to be a big episode, and it's yeah probably coming in the next week or so, and then I'm going to take a hiatus for at least until the new year, just so that I can get some work done on my book, which I hope will be coming out early next
Some
year.
sanity. Uh,
Yes, it's because it's
yeah.
like I said to you earlier, man, it's such a lot of work putting together a podcast. And this is again why I tip my hat to you because you've put something out every week for like 4 years. That's quite an achievement, especially with your other interest in music in particular.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm in crunch time right now actually as well because we've got a tour coming up in November, so I have to have everything ready and uploaded and ready to go before I leave. And ideally,
Wow.
that should include a couple weeks after too, because I'm
Mm,
not going to get back home and immediately produce podcast episodes.
No, no.
it takes quite a while, as you know, to work on all these
Hmm.
things. So, yeah, so I'm very much looking forward to that episode. I'm really glad
Great.
we've connected, found your show.
Yeah,
You'll have to
yeah.
remind me about Athens next year, but
I
I,
will.
I think, I think that might be feasible depending on
Mm,
the date and what else I'm doing at that time, because you just never know. Again, with the music world and all of
yes,
that.
of
But
course.
so you've got the book coming out. You have your show. Is there
Mm.
anything else? Do you want to? Can you give everyone just sort of where they can find you, or anything else you want to shout out that you're working on? Anything like that?
Sure. I mean, my project is well developed, but it's still a work in progress. And, this is the time for people to get on board if they're interested in this, because I'm looking to involve people, like recruit experimenters who want to participate in some of this work. So, as a first step, check out the podcast, which is on all the usual platforms. And you can follow Will to Joy on social media too. I've recorded a few videos that I'll be publishing soon as well. And I see Nietzschean philosophy and what I'm trying to do with it as a campaign against ordinariness and joylessness, against that sort of terrible, disempowering blight on life, shame. As he writes it, I've got a quote here from Gay Science 273. What is the seal of liberation? To no longer be ashamed of oneself. I think that for me is a really significant target for this project. And for me, Nietzsche's philosophy is a formula for re-enchanting the world, for re-spiritualizing it, but a spirituality without spirits, without any supernaturalisms, and the rediscovery of something that we've sadly lost for all the gains of the Enlightenment. The world is bereft of wonder in a way that it wasn't in the past. So, yeah, join me, I would say, and hopefully, at the culmination of this project, people will be able to validate, celebrate, and feel like the most profound gratitude for existence. I mean, that's what Amor Fati means, really, isn't it? And is there any treasure rarer or more precious than that?
Well, that was a very, I'm sure will be a very tempting offer. As you said, you were wanting experimenters to join you. So I thought of
Yes.
Nietzsche's tempters
Tempters.
and
Yeah.
attempters. So
Yes.
yeah, go and join the project at the Will to Joy podcast. But thank you very much, Jimmy, for joining me. Glad we've connected.
Thank you so much, Keegan. Yeah, really, really enjoyed it. All the best.
Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.